Either you throw this nonsense out of your head right now, or I don't know what I'll do to myself, Pavlo, because this has gone too far. Sofia Nikolaevna did not shout, yet her voice trembled like a taut violin string, vibrating with such cold fury that the small kitchen seemed to drop several degrees. The smell of boiled buckwheat and black tea hung in the air, heavy and stale. She slammed a small velvet box onto the table. It struck the wooden surface with a dull knock and slid a few centimeters before stopping beside the sugar bowl, like a silent witness to a crime. Pavlo froze in the doorway. He had only just come home from work, still wearing his coat, the damp chill of the evening clinging to him. For a moment he did not move. Something tightened deep inside his chest, that old, sticky fear he remembered from childhood, mixed now with a slow, burning irritation. He inhaled slowly. "Mom, please don't start," he said quietly. He stepped forward and placed his broad hand over the box, shielding it from her gaze as if protecting something fragile. "This is my life. I will decide when and to whom I propose. I'm 32, not 12. "Your life!" Sofia threw up her hands. Red patches spread across her cheeks, the same ones that always appeared when her blood pressure shot up. "You call this life? Getting involved with a divorced woman older than you and with a child? Aren't your own problems enough?"
Now you want to feed someone else's brat too?
Pavlo slowly raised his head. A dangerous spark flashed in his eyes, a look Sofia had seen only a few times in her life. "Don't you dare talk about Olena like that." He pronounced every word carefully, like someone placing stones across thin ice. "She's a wonderful woman. And her son is a great kid. Just because her first marriage failed doesn't make her worse than anyone else." "Oh, listen to him," Sofia laughed sharply, clutching her chest as she sank into the chair. "He's in love." The words sounded almost obscene in her mouth. "This isn't love, you fool. She wrapped you around her finger, found herself a young idiot with no apartment of his own. Of course she tries hard. She needs a neck to sit on." Pavlo felt the corners of the velvet box digging into his palm. Outside the window, a March wind scraped dry branches across the glass. The old refrigerator in the corner hummed endlessly, like some tired mechanical animal. "You still live with me?" Sofia continued, her voice growing sharper. "Where exactly will you live? Here? In my 2-room apartment? I will not turn my home into a hostel." Pavlo slowly slipped the box into the pocket of his jeans. Its hard edges pressed against his thigh. This conversation had been coming for months, ever since his mother first saw him standing near the entrance with Olena, laughing about something under the yellow courtyard lamp. But tonight something felt different, something final. He looked at Sofia, a small, thin woman with perfectly styled grey hair and carefully painted lips. A woman who had spent her entire life building an altar called motherhood and placing her only son on it like a sacred offering. "We won't live here," he said quietly. "I've already rented an apartment." The kitchen fell into such silence that even the buzzing refrigerator sounded loud. Sofia's face drained of color. Her hand trembled as she reached for a glass of water, spilling some onto the tablecloth. "You're abandoning your mother?" she whispered. The whisper carried more poison than any scream. "For her? For some чужая woman? After everything I've done for you? I lived for you, Pavlo. I threw your father out when he drank. I worked 2 jobs so you could study, so you could become a man." Pavlo felt a dull headache begin to pulse behind his temples. "Mom, enough with the manipulation," he said quietly. "I'm not abandoning you. I just want to build my own family. That's normal. Children grow up and leave home. That's how life works." "In normal families," Sofia snapped, her voice rising again, "sons marry decent girls, young ones, without baggage, without chuzhie children." Her eyes narrowed. "And this Olena, I already found out everything about her." Pavlo's stomach tightened. "Don't think I'm blind," she continued coldly. "People talk. The neighbor from the third entrance said her husband didn't leave her for nothing. Oh no. Maybe she's the type who runs around with men." Pavlo abruptly turned away. He could feel anger boiling under his skin now. He walked into the corridor, grabbing his sneakers. Behind him, Sofia's voice followed like a swarm of sharp needles. "You'll see, Pavlo. You'll regret it. She will ruin your life." He opened the heavy metal door and stepped out into the evening. The cold air hit his face immediately. A fine drizzle fell over the darkened streets of Vinica, turning the asphalt black and slick. Yellow tram wires hummed overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a trolleybus groaned through the wet intersection. Pavlo pulled up his collar and started walking. He could have reached Alena's apartment in 15 minutes, but tonight he needed those 15 minutes to breathe, to quiet the storm inside his head. Because behind him, in the warm kitchen with the humming refrigerator, his old life had just begun to crack. The rain followed Pavlo all the way down the street like a quiet accusation. Drops tapped against his coat collar and slid down the back of his neck, cold and persistent. The courtyard lights reflected in wet asphalt, turning every puddle into a trembling mirror. Somewhere nearby, a tram screeched along the rails, metal grinding against metal. He walked without hurrying, hands deep in his pockets. The velvet box pressed against his thigh with every step. Strange how such a small object could carry so much weight. For 32 years, Pavlo had lived inside the narrow orbit of his mother's expectations. Good school, good university, good job. No risks, no scandals, no women who could complicate life. And for most of those years, he had obeyed. Not because he was weak, he knew he wasn't, but because Sofia Mykolaievna possessed a quiet, suffocating authority that filled every corner of their apartment like invisible smoke. Even now, walking away, he felt the old reflex pulling at him. Turn back, apologize, calm her down. But he kept walking. Ahead, the grey blocks of the Vyshenka district rose from the mist, their windows glowing like scattered constellations. The smell of damp concrete mixed with the sweet scent of bakery bread drifting from a late-night kiosk. Olena lived on the third floor of a modest 9-story building with a broken elevator and chipped green paint on the stair railings. Pavlo stopped at the entrance and exhaled slowly. Inside that apartment waited something he had never truly known before. Warmth. Real, human warmth. Not the polished, museum-like cleanliness of his mother's home. He pressed the intercom code. The door buzzed open with a tired mechanical click. The stairwell smelled of dust, boiled potatoes, and someone's cheap detergent. Light flickered overhead as he climbed the steps 2 at a time. Before he could even reach the door, it opened. Dennis stood there barefoot in dinosaur pajamas, clutching a plastic airplane. "Uncle Pavlo!" the boy shouted, his face lighting up like a switched-on lamp. Pavlo felt something inside his chest soften instantly. "Hey there, pilot," he said, lifting the boy into the air. Dennis laughed, a bright, ringing laugh that echoed down the hallway. "We're making cherry dumplings," the boy announced proudly. "Mom says mine look like aliens, but they taste better." From the kitchen came the sound of running water and the faint clatter of dishes. Then Olena appeared. She wiped her hands on a flour-dusted apron, a loose strand of hair falling across her cheek. A thin streak of white flour marked her temple like accidental war paint. And yet, she looked beautiful in a way Pavlo could never quite explain. Not polished, not perfect, just real. She studied his face quietly for a moment. "You look tired," she said softly. Pavlo shrugged, forcing a small smile. "Long day." But Olena's eyes were perceptive, steady. She stepped closer and touched his cheek lightly with the back of her fingers. "Your mother again?" He hesitated. For a moment the kitchen lights, the smell of cherries and dough, the warmth of the small apartment felt dangerously fragile, like a fragile bubble that could burst if he spoke the truth. So he lied. "Nothing serious," he said, "just the usual." Olena didn't press him. She simply nodded and turned toward the kitchen. "Well then, engineer," she said gently, "wash your hands and help us."
We made enough dough to feed half the city. Soon the table was covered with flour. Denis proudly shaped crooked dumplings that barely held together. Olena laughed every time one burst open and cherry juice stained the dough bright red. Pavlo watched them both. The easy chaos, the laughter, the quiet domestic music of plates, spoons, and voices. For the first time that day, the knot in his chest began to loosen. This, he thought, must be what happiness feels like. Not grand, not dramatic, just a small kitchen filled with warmth. Later, when Denis had gone to bed and the apartment grew quiet, Pavlo finally reached into his pocket. The velvet box appeared in his palm. He hadn't planned to do this tonight. He had imagined candles, a restaurant, maybe even music. But life rarely waited for perfect timing. "Olena," he said. His voice trembled slightly. She turned from the sink, drying her hands slowly. When she saw the box, she froze. Water continued running quietly in the sink behind her, unnoticed. Pavlo opened the lid. "I know we haven't known each other long," he said, "but I know one thing for sure." He took a breath. "I don't want to go back to an empty life. I want mornings with you. I want to raise Denis with you. I want us to be a family." He looked straight into her eyes. "Will you marry me?" For a moment the room felt completely still. Then Olena closed the tap, dried her hands carefully on the towel, and sat down across from him. Her eyes were filled with something he did not expect. Not joy, not surprise, but a quiet, aching sadness. "Pavlo," she whispered. "I love you." She paused. "But your mother will never accept me." The words hung in the warm kitchen air like the first distant rumble of a coming storm. For several seconds Pavlo did not move. The ring box remained open in his hand, the small stone catching the warm yellow light of the kitchen lamp. It seemed absurdly bright against the quiet heaviness that had suddenly filled the room. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. Olena looked down at the table where traces of flour still dusted the wood. "She came to my work today." The words landed between them with dull weight. Pavlo blinked. "My mother went to your store?" Olena nodded. It was around lunchtime. The shop was full. People were standing in line with baskets and carts. She walked straight to the register and waited until everyone was looking. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. She didn't shout. She spoke very calmly. That was the worst part. Pavlo felt his stomach twist. What did she say? Olena lifted her eyes. She said, "Young woman, have some shame. Leave my son alone. You only want his money and his apartment. He has his whole life ahead of him, and you're dragging him down with чуже child." The words seemed to echo in the kitchen. Pavlo felt heat rush into his face. "Everyone was staring," Olena continued quietly. "Customers, my co-workers. Even the security guard. I felt like some kind of thief." She forced a small, brittle smile. "I almost cried right there at the register." Pavlo closed the ring box slowly. His fingers trembled. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know." Olena shook her head gently. "That's not the worst part." Pavlo looked up. "She said that if I don't leave you," Olena continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "she'll make sure I can't live peacefully in this city. She knows the owner of the shop. She knows my landlord." A cold silence settled between them. In the next room, Dennis shifted in his sleep, the bed springs creaking softly. Pavlo felt anger rising inside him, slow and heavy like dark water behind a dam. "She had no right," he said hoarsely. "I'll deal with this, I promise. She won't come near you again." Olena gave a sad little laugh. "How will you deal with it?" She looked at him carefully. "She's your mother, Pavlo." He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. For 32 years, Sofia Nikolaevna had been the unmovable center of his world. Every decision eventually curved back toward her approval. And now that center was colliding with the future he wanted. "I can't just erase her," he admitted quietly. "That's exactly why this is impossible," Olena said. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, rain traced thin lines across the glass. "I don't want to be the reason you fight with your mother every day," she continued. "I've already lived through one war in a marriage. I won't start another." Pavlo stood up abruptly. The chair scraped loudly across the floor. "No," he said firmly. "No pauses. No running away." He crossed the kitchen and knelt beside her chair. "I love you, Olena, and I'm not letting anyone, even my mother, decide my life for me." He opened the box again. The ring glimmered between them. "Please," he said quietly, "don't push me away because of her." Olena studied his face for a long time. In his eyes she saw fear, stubbornness, and something new, a fragile but real determination. Finally she sighed. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," Pavlo said. Another long moment passed. Then she gave a small, almost invisible nod. "Okay." The word felt like a fragile bridge built over deep water. Pavlo slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Neither of them spoke. But in that silent kitchen, with rain whispering against the window and the smell of cherries still lingering in the air, they made a quiet promise to face whatever storm waited outside together. They didn't yet know that the storm had already begun. The next morning began before sunrise. Pavlo woke in the half-dark silence of the apartment he had shared with his mother his entire life. The hallway smelled faintly of chamomile tea and the medicinal bitterness of valerian drops, Sofia Nikolaevna's nightly ritual. From behind her closed door came the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He moved quietly. Every small sound seemed magnified. The zipper of the sports bag, the creak of the wardrobe door, the rustle of folded shirts. He packed quickly, methodically. Clothes, documents, laptop, a few books. Not much. 32 years of life compressed into 2 dark bags. His hands worked automatically, but his thoughts were loud. Images of Olena's kitchen kept returning to him. The wharf, the laughter, Dennis proudly holding up crooked dumplings. It had felt so simple there, so natural. Here, everything felt heavy, like air before a thunderstorm.
He had just closed the second bag when the door behind him creaked. "Are you leaving?" The voice was hoarse, almost unfamiliar. Pavlo turned. Sofia Mikolaevna stood in the doorway in her old flannel robe, her grey hair loose and slightly disordered. Without her usual careful appearance, she suddenly looked smaller, older, almost fragile. For a moment, guilt pricked him sharply. "Yes," he said quietly. He lifted one of the bags. "I warned you yesterday." She leaned against the doorframe, gripping it with thin fingers. "So it's true," she murmured. "You're abandoning your mother." "I'm not abandoning you," Pavlo replied, forcing calm into his voice. "I'm just moving out. I'll still help you. I'll visit." "To live with her," Sofia said. It was not a question. "To build my life," Pavlo corrected. The kitchen clock ticked loudly somewhere in the apartment. Sofia slowly walked into the corridor. "You traded your mother for a woman with baggage," she said coldly, "after everything I sacrificed." Pavlo closed his eyes briefly. "Mom, please." "I worked 2 jobs for you," she continued, her voice rising. "I threw your drunken father out so you wouldn't grow up in filth. I gave you everything." "And I'm grateful," Pavlo said. "But gratitude doesn't mean I belong to you forever." Her eyes flashed. "Belong?" she repeated. "I raised you. I shaped you. Without me, you would be nothing." The words cut deeper than she realized. Pavlo lifted the bags. "If you leave now," Sofia said suddenly, her voice turning icy, "don't come back." He paused. "I'll change the locks. I'll remove your registration from the apartment. You won't have a home here anymore." The ultimatum hung in the air like frost. Pavlo felt a strange calm settle inside him. "Then that's your choice," he said. He walked to the door and opened it. Behind him, Sofia's breathing grew uneven. "You're doing this for her," she whispered. "For a stranger." "No," Pavlo replied quietly. "I'm doing it for myself." He stepped into the stairwell. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind him with a hollow clang that echoed down the concrete steps. For a long moment he stood there, gripping the handles of the bags. Something inside him had just broken loose. Outside, the early morning city was still grey and sleepy. A few buses groaned through wet streets, and the air smelled of cold pavement and distant bakery bread. Pavlo walked toward the taxi stand with slow, determined steps. Within 2 weeks, he had rented a small one-room apartment on the far side of the city, in an old building where the wallpaper peeled and the sofa sagged like tired shoulders. But it was freedom. Olena helped him carry dishes, curtains, even a small lamp that cast a warm golden light over the empty room. They decided not to move in together immediately. Dennis needed time, and Pavlo needed to learn how to live independently after so many years under his mother's roof. Still, most evenings he found himself back in Olena's kitchen, laughing, breathing easier. For the first time in years, he felt like his life was moving forward. But Sofia Mikolaevna remained silent. No calls, no messages. The silence felt wrong. Too calm. As if somewhere, far away, a storm was quietly gathering strength. And then, one Friday evening, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Pavlo Serhiovich," a dry male voice asked. "Yes?" "This is the emergency department of the city hospital." Pavlo's heart dropped. "Your mother has been admitted 30 minutes ago. Hypertensive crisis. Possible stroke." The word seemed to tilt slightly. "I'm coming," Pavlo said hoarsely. Beside him in the park, Olena had already understood everything from his face. "Your mom?" she asked softly. He nodded. Olena didn't hesitate. "I'm calling a taxi," she said firmly.
Let's go." The hospital corridors smelled of chlorine and fear. Doctor spoke quickly. Nurses handed him lists of medications, forms to sign, instructions he barely understood. Olena stayed beside him quietly, holding his coat, bringing water, helping him focus. Finally, they were allowed into the ward. Sofia Mykolaievna lay on the hospital bed beneath pale, fluorescent light. Her face looked strangely twisted, one eyelid drooping slightly. Tubes ran from her arm to a slow dripping IV. She was conscious. When she saw Pavlo, her lips trembled. "You came," she whispered weakly. "Yes, Mom," he said, taking her cold hand. "I'm here." Her eyes moved slowly past his shoulder. They stopped on Olena, standing quietly near the door. For a moment, something dark flashed in them. "Get her out," Sofia croaked suddenly. Pavlo froze. "What?" "Her," Sofia repeated, struggling to raise her voice. "Make her leave." The monitor beside the bed began to beep faster. "She's the reason," Sofia rasped. "She did this to me." Olena stepped backward toward the corridor, pale and silent. "Mom, stop," Pavlo said urgently. "You need to stay calm." "Either she goes," Sofia whispered, gripping his sleeve with surprising strength, "or I pull this needle out and die right now." The heart monitor screamed louder. A nurse rushed into the room. "Everyone outside," she snapped. Within seconds, Pavlo found himself standing in the cold hospital corridor. Olena sat on a plastic chair, her face buried in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were full of tears. "This will never end," she whispered. And Pavlo suddenly realized she might be right. The next month turned Pavlo's life into something grey and airless. Sofia Mykolaievna survived. The doctors later explained that the stroke had been micro, that with rest and medication she would recover. But they also insisted on strict conditions: no stress, constant monitoring, someone nearby at all times. And Sofia made sure there was only one possible candidate. "I will not have strangers in my home," she declared the moment Pavlo suggested hiring a nurse. Her voice trembled dramatically as she clutched her chest. "A Chuzha woman walking through my apartment? Touching my things? Over my dead body." The blood pressure monitor beeped angrily beside her. Pavlo gave in. Within days, he had moved back. The rented apartment on the other side of the city was cancelled, the deposit lost. His bags returned to the same narrow room he had grown up in, where the wallpaper still carried faint outlines of posters he had hung there as a teenager. Sofia changed too. She moved slowly now, leaning on furniture, complaining of dizziness, headaches, weakness. She asked Pavlo to measure her pressure, bring tea, sit beside her in the evenings while she watched television. "Just until I get stronger," she would say softly. But something in her eyes was different. Whenever Olena's name appeared in conversation, the softness vanished instantly. "You were with her again?" she asked once when Pavlo came home 20 minutes late from work. Her voice was thin but sharp. "While your mother lies here alone?" Pavlo felt the familiar trap closing around him. Visits to Olena became rare, short, secret. Sometimes he would stop by for only half an hour after work. Denis would cling to his arm, asking questions about airplanes and construction cranes. Olena smiled, but the tiredness in her eyes grew deeper every week. The distance between them stretched quietly. Until one evening, she finally spoke. Denis was spending the weekend with his grandmother in the countryside, and the apartment felt strangely empty without his constant movement. Olena stood near the window, arms folded. "We need to talk, Pavlo." He sensed immediately what was coming. "What happened?" he asked. "What happened is that we stopped being a couple," she replied calmly. The words landed like stones. "You live with your mother again, she continued. You serve your mother. Your entire life revolves around her illness. She almost died, Pavlo said quietly. Olena's expression tightened. She walks perfectly fine when you're not around. Pavlo frowned. What do you mean? I saw her yesterday, Olena said, on the street near the market, carrying 2 heavy bags of groceries. The moment she noticed me, she suddenly started limping and grabbing the wall. Pavlo felt irritation rise.
Are you spying on her? I was walking down the same street, Olena replied sharply. Pavlo, please open your eyes. She is manipulating you. He shook his head. That's cruel. No, Olena said softly. Cruel is what she's doing to us. Silence filled the kitchen. I can't live like this, she added after a moment, waiting until your mother decides we're allowed to exist. What do you want me to do? Pavlo asked. Be an adult, she answered simply. Hire a nurse, set boundaries, return to your life. Her eyes searched his face. If you don't do it now, we're finished. The ultimatum hung heavily between them. Pavlo rubbed his forehead. Give me 1 week, he said finally. I'll talk to her, I promise. Olena studied him carefully. 1 week, she repeated. But that's the last chance. That night, Pavlo walked home with determination burning in his chest. Tomorrow, he decided, everything would change. But when he entered the apartment, Sofia sat calmly in the living room, knitting under the warm glow of a lamp. She looked peaceful, almost cheerful. Dinner is on the stove, she said sweetly. Pavlo didn't remove his coat. Mom, he said firmly, we need to talk. She lowered the knitting needles slowly. Her eyes sharpened. About what? About my life, Pavlo replied. I'm going back to Olena. A nurse will start helping you next week. For a second, Sofia simply stared. Then she laughed, a thin, cold sound. You think you're clever, she said quietly. She rose from the chair and walked to the cabinet, opening a drawer. Before you make that decision, she continued, pulling out a white envelope, you should see something. She dropped the envelope into Pavlo's hands. Inside were several photographs. In the pictures, Olena sat in a cafe across from a tall man. They were laughing, leaning toward each other across the table. The timestamp showed last week. That, Sofia said triumphantly, is her ex-husband. Pavlo felt the floor shift under him. He came back, Sofia continued smoothly, and while you were here measuring my blood pressure, she was meeting him. Pavlo stared at the photographs. Olena's smile, the man's hand on the table near hers. His chest tightened painfully. She didn't tell you, did she? Sofia whispered. Something inside Pavlo cracked. I'll ask her myself, he muttered. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of the apartment. 20 minutes later, he stood outside Olena's building. And there she was, standing near the entrance, talking to the same man from the photographs. The man gestured angrily while speaking. At one point, he reached for Olena's hand. She didn't pull away immediately. A hot wave of jealousy and betrayal crashed through Pavlo. So his mother had been right. He turned away before Olena noticed him. Her voice called his name behind him, but he kept walking. Back into the night. Back into the quiet prison waiting at home. For a month, Pavlo lived like a man walking through fog. Days passed in dull repetition. Construction site, noise of drills, grey office meetings. Then the silent apartment where Sofia Nikolaevna waited with tea already poured and television murmuring softly. She seemed stronger now, almost glowing with quiet satisfaction. The tremor in her hands had disappeared, and she moved through the kitchen with surprising energy. Yet, every evening she sighed theatrically and touched her chest. "Still weak," she would say, "but at least I have my son." Pavlo rarely answered. Inside him something had gone numb. He did not call Olena. Pride held him back like a locked door, even though her voice echoed constantly in his memory. Sometimes at night he imagined Dennis asking where Uncle Pavlo had gone, and guilt burned like acid in his stomach. Sofia noticed the silence and fed it carefully. "You see," she murmured one evening while pouring tea, "if she truly loved you, she would have come to explain. Instead, she ran back to her old husband." Pavlo stared at the dark liquid in his cup. Maybe she was right. Maybe everything had been an illusion. The turning point arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The construction site roared with machinery and the sharp metallic smell of fresh-cut steel. Pavlo stepped outside the temporary office trailer for a cigarette when he noticed the familiar figure pacing near the gate. It was the tall man from the photographs, Olena's ex-husband, Andriy. The man looked restless, kicking gravel with the toe of his shoe. His leather jacket was worn, his eyes red from sleeplessness or drink. Pavlo felt anger flare instantly. "What do you want?" he asked coldly, approaching the gate. Andriy looked up and gave a crooked smile. "Finally found you," he muttered. "Your mother's harder to reach than a bank vault." Pavlo stiffened. "What does my mother have to do with you?" Andriy spat onto the ground. "She owes me money." The words sounded absurd. "What nonsense are you talking about?" Andriy leaned closer, lowering his voice. "For the show." Pavlo frowned. "What show?" "The one we staged outside Olena's building," Andriy said casually. "Your mother hired me. Said if I made it look like Olena and I were getting back together, you'd run away from her." The world seemed to tilt. "What?" Pavlo whispered. "She paid me 7,000 up front," Andriy continued. "Promised 15 total. But after the performance, she disappeared. I still want the rest." Pavlo grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the metal fence. "You're lying." "Why would I lie?" Andriy gasped. "Ask her yourself. I grabbed Olena's hand, argued with her, made a scene. She didn't even know what was happening. And then you showed up, right on cue." Pavlo slowly released him. The puzzle pieces inside his mind began to rearrange themselves with terrifying clarity. The photographs, the sudden evidence, the perfectly timed drama at the entrance. A trap. All of it. Andriy straightened his jacket nervously. "Look, I don't care about your love story," he muttered. "Just tell your mother to pay me. Otherwise, I'll tell Olena everything." But Pavlo was no longer listening. His chest felt hollow. Within an hour, he stood inside the familiar apartment again. Sofia sat in the living room, knitting calmly. "Back early," she said pleasantly. Pavlo walked in and switched off the television. The silence that followed was heavy. "I met Andriy today." The knitting needle stopped. For a moment, Sofia's expression flickered. "What about him?" she asked carefully. "He told me about the money," Pavlo said quietly. "About the staged scene, about the photographs, about the lie." The color drained from her face. Then the mask slipped completely. "So what if I did?" she snapped suddenly. "I saved you from ruining your life." Pavlo felt a deep, exhausted sadness. "You destroyed it," he said. She stepped forward, furious now. "I am your mother. I know what's best for you." "No," Pavlo replied softly. "You know what's best for you." He turned and walked to his room. The same suitcase waited in the closet. This time he packed slowly. When he returned to the hallway, Sofia stood there trembling with rage. "If you walk out now," she hissed, "you are no longer my son." Pavlo placed the apartment keys on the table. "I think I stopped being your son a long time ago," he said gently.
Outside, night had already fallen.
He took a taxi across the city and stood for a long time in front of Olena's building, gathering courage. Finally, he rang the bell. The door opened. Olena stood there with a book in her hand. When she saw the suitcase, her expression hardened. "What do you want, Pavlo?" He swallowed. "The truth." And slowly, painfully, he told her everything. About his mother, about Andriy, about the lie that had torn them apart. When he finished, the kitchen was silent. "You didn't believe me," Olena said quietly. "I know." She wiped a tear from her cheek. That hurt more than anything. Pavlo lowered his head. "I can't change that. But I left her tonight, for good." From the bedroom came soft footsteps. Denis appeared in the doorway, sleepy and confused. "Uncle Pavlo?" Pavlo knelt instinctively. The boy hesitated only a second before running into his arms. "You came back," Denis said happily. Pavlo held him tightly and looked up at Olena. She watched them both, tears shining in her eyes. "I can't promise everything will be the same," she said after a long pause. "I know. But maybe," she added quietly, "we can start again." Outside the window, the city lights shimmered softly in the night, and for the first time in many months, Pavlo felt the weight on his chest begin to lift.